When I mention the names Hayao Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli, the first thing you think of is probably not camera work, because, they don't use cameras.
Cut.
Well, okay, they did, but not in the same way that a live-action production would use a camera. You get what I mean. But don't let that fool you. Even in the realm of animated films, cinematography remains incredibly important in telling a compelling story. I'm Swamp John, welcome to the channel. Let's take Miyazaki's Princess Mononoke and put it face to face with the work of the other most influential Japanese filmmaker of all time, and see what common threads we can find. The challenge of filmmaking, whether live action or animated, has always been the same, finding a way to convey a story through visual images and movement. So before we talk about Miyazaki, let's go back in time a bit. Okay, not quite that far. Better. And if you're only here for the anime, stick around at least for this first section. I think it's really interesting to think about anime within the context of the greater continuum of visual storytelling, because it is part of that history. This is Throne of Blood, or Spider's Web Fortress, an adaptation of Shakespeare's Macbeth, set in feudal Japan. It was directed by Akira Kurosawa and photographed by Asakazu Nakai. Cinematography is all about conveying emotion through shot scale, composition, and camera movement. And as a master of composition and framing, Kurosawa and his films demonstrated the power of this art form and inspired many that came after. For example, this perfectly symmetrical tracking shot of Generals Washizu and Miki feels orderly, important, and regal, whereas this long shot of Washizu contemplating the consequences of his actions feels almost paranoid. Washizu is small and hunched in the center of the space, and the shot is framed tightly by the doorway, giving a sense of claustrophobia. In this shot, Washizu searches frantically through the forest for a spirit who earlier had foretold that he was destined to become the lord of the northern garrison. The camera is disorienting as it moves erratically through the trees, giving us no sense of direction. At times it's even hard to tell which way is up. The closely framed shot feels almost disconnected from the more dispassionate static shots of Washizu riding through the forest. Here, we're viewing this scene from the perspective of an outside observer with a detached, objective view of reality. But as we inhabit his point of view and the camera mimics the character's erratic head movements, our sense of direction fades away and is entirely replaced by a sense of panic and urgency. So, how does this all relate to the mostly hand-drawn works of Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli? Let's explore that by looking in depth at the 1997 film
Princess Mononoke?
Partially because it was the first Ghibli film to incorporate digital technology, thus giving it more capability for simulated camera movement, and partially just because it's the best. I mean, come on. First, let's look closely at this sequence. This is the fight scene between San, aka
Princess Mononoke,
and Lady Eboshi in the center of Irontown. At this early point in the film, San is entirely fueled by rage. She acts like a feral wolf whose only goal is to kill all humans at any cost, even at the cost of her own life. Side note, in the English dub, this guy is played by this guy, who also plays this guy.
Kill all humans!
Coincidence? You decide. So we begin with a point of view shot where we view the scene through San's eyes as she charges towards Lady Eboshi. Eboshi stands still in the center of the symmetrical frame with all perspective lines pointing at her. She is important and in control of her surroundings. Meanwhile, the simulated camera dollies swiftly forward and we see a drastic separation between the elements that are close and far away. The space feels stretched as it would with the use of a wide-angle lens. This aspect gives us the sense of the dramatic intensity that San brings to this scene. Next, we get a series of quickly cut close-up shots with a moving camera, which is often obstructed by the bodies of the other characters in the scene. Notice how, just like that shot of the forest in Throne of Blood, many of these shots don't really give us any sense of where the ground or sky are. There's no visible horizon line to stabilize the scene. All we see is people and disorienting close-up action shots. We're occupying San's mind and feeling her intense determination to kill Lady Eboshi. Now we cut to Ashitaka, who tends to act as a moderator between the two sides. To illustrate this dynamic, we now get more slow, static, wide shots as he walks calmly into the fray to defuse the situation. In this scene, Washizu's wife, Asaji, discusses tactics with him and tries to convince him to aspire to the throne and assassinate his lord Suzuki while he sleeps. As two servants appear to notify them that Washizu's sleeping quarters are prepared, the camera dollies left around the characters' backs. This movement is motivated by the motion of the servants' torches outside the room, but it also signifies a change in Washizu's outlook. The 180-degree rule is a basic filmmaking rule of thumb which states that in any scene where two characters interact, you should draw an imaginary line between them, and the camera should always stay on one side of that line of action. This way, one character is always looking to the right of the camera and the other is always looking to the left, and the audience doesn't get confused by the geography of the scene. Crossing this line can be disorienting, but when done intentionally, it can convey a paradigm shift of some kind in the scene. Washizu is completely silent for most of this scene, contemplating his wife's advice, but as the camera slides behind his back and across the line of action, the scene is now reframed, illustrating his change in perspective. He's been convinced, and the trajectory of his life is about to change, and now, facing away from the camera, is the time for action. The complimentary scene in Princess Mononoke comes near the start when the wise woman of the village reads Prince Ashitaka's fortune after he's cursed by the wild boar spirit. She tells him that it's his fate to leave the village and travel to the west where he may be able to lift the curse. The trajectory of Ashitaka's life changes in this moment too. As he accepts his fate, the change is symbolized by him cutting off his hair, but also by the camera jumping the line of action. Throughout this dialogue scene, and even as he cuts his hair, the simulated camera sits just slightly to the side of Ashitaka's left shoulder. But once it's done, for the final shot, the scene is reframed and we jump to the other side of the line of action, where Ashitaka is now looking to the right of the camera, instead of the left. Making the camera slide across a scene like this in 2D animation is no simple task, so this transition with a simple cut is much subtler, but it conveys the same meaning. This is the moment when our protagonists make the choice to embark on a new destiny. Speaking of animation being no simple task, a quick intermission while we enjoy Miyazaki's reaction to Kurosawa talking about the importance of fun, beer, and a lighthearted spirit on the set of his movies. And while we're at it, why don't you go ahead and hit the like button? This is from a brief 1993 TV special where the two met for the first time, just after the release of Kurosawa's final film.
だからよくスタッフに言うんだけど、こう不機嫌な状態で撮ってたらね、嫌な顔になるよって映画って。楽しくやろうよっつって、もうゲラゲラ笑ったりなんかしてやってるんですけどね。これがやっぱり必要ですね。
Okay, finally, let's look at a shot that repeats itself constantly across both of these films. This one. As Ashitaka and Washizu ride through the forest, the camera follows, obstructed by a layer of branches and foliage, which, in the case of Throne of Blood, form a tangled web in front of the camera, lending credibility to the name of the Spider's Web Forest. This shot reoccurs in both films, again and again and again. The layer of trees obstructing the camera gives a sense of immense velocity to the movement. What makes this shot especially interesting, though, is how it has evolved over time. With a physical camera, especially a giant, heavy one from 1957, it would be impossible to achieve the flying through the trees effect we see in Princess Mononoke. So Kurosawa simulated it. In each of these shots, the camera is actually stationary, but as it pans through the trees, essentially just rotating in a semicircle, the telephoto lens compresses the space and sells the illusion. An animation studio, of course, has no restrictions of real physical space. In these shots, the simulated camera is able to fly right alongside the characters, putting the viewer into the action even more. The arts of filmmaking and cinematography were developed with the physicality of cameras and actors in mind, but they're ever evolving, like all art forms, and as new technology comes about, it gives creatives new opportunities to emulate the work that came before them in new ways. Kurosawa and Miyazaki are a perfect example of this relationship. The shiny, colorful images of animation may seem far removed from the classical methods of film production from the 50s and before, but if you look closely, this may be more closely related to this than you imagined. And likewise, as the clock continues to turn, this innovator also becomes the old master, and this becomes this. Not that. This. Thanks for watching. And thanks for subscribing if you're the type of dark, twisted freak who likes this kind of video. See you next time.